Ever find yourself kind of looking back at some historical figure and you're just like, what were they thinking? You know, judging them by like today's standards.
Hmm.
Well, that's exactly what we're diving into today, this whole idea of judging historical figures, you know, through our modern lens.
Right.
It's definitely a topic with tons of nuance, and we've got some really fascinating research to guide our deep dive.
Yeah, and you know what I think is so interesting about this whole discussion is this idea of historical relativism.
Okay.
It's this fascinating concept that every era, every period in time has its own set of norms.
Mm.
And what might seem totally outrageous to us today could have been just like normal a few centuries back.
So are we saying we like can't judge people from the past at all because they lived in a totally different time?
But it's not about saying we can't judge, but I think understanding the context is super important.
Okay.
Like, take the example of slavery. I
Right.
mean, it was a horrific reality,
Mm.
woven into so many ancient civilizations.
Right.
You think about Aristotle, right?
Mhm.
Brilliant philosopher who pondered ethics and virtue,
Mm-hmm.
but he lived in a society where slavery was commonplace.
That's so interesting. So how do we like reconcile his philosophical ideas about, you know, ethics and virtue with the acceptance of slavery during his time?
Yeah, that's where things get tricky. You see, in ancient Greece, slavery wasn't seen in the same way it is now.
Okay.
It was seen as an economic necessity. Some even saw it as a natural order.
Wow.
And Aristotle, despite his emphasis on virtue, he didn't challenge this system.
Hmm.
So does that diminish his philosophical contributions? That's something I think we all need to think about.
Yeah, it's a tough question. But what about figures like George Washington? He fought for liberty and democracy, but he also owned slaves.
Yeah,
It feels like such a contradiction.
it does, doesn't it? And this contradiction really highlights, the limitations of judging historical figures just through today's lens.
Okay.
We can recognize Washington's incredible contributions to the founding of the United States, but also recognize that he was a product of his time, like many others back then. His views on slavery, while horrible to us, were sadly not uncommon then.
So understanding the context is key. But doesn't it feel like some things are just wrong no matter when they happened?
You've hit on a really important point. There's definitely a counter-argument to this historical relativism idea.
Okay.
Some acts like genocide or torture
Yeah.
seem universally wrong, regardless of the historical context. We're
Yeah.
talking about, inherent violations of human dignity,
Mm-hmm.
principles that I'd argue transcend time and culture.
You know, that reminds me of something the research highlighted.
Oh.
Even during periods like colonialism, there were voices of dissent. People who saw it as inherently wrong.
Right.
It's like those who fought against slavery, even when it was the norm, were tapping into this deeper sense of morality.
Exactly. Their existence really does suggest there might be these universal moral principles.
Mm.
But it also brings up this interesting question. Were these individuals ahead of their time, morally superior? Or are we kind of imposing our understanding of morality onto the past?
See, this is where it gets so interesting for me. It's so easy for us to sit here in our modern world and judge.
I know, right?
It's like, come on, how could you not see that was wrong? But we forget history unfolded in real time. They didn't have the benefit of hindsight.
And that's where the concept of hindsight bias comes in.
Hmm.
We tend to look at past events as more predictable than they really were.
Okay.
It's like watching a movie for the second time,
Right.
you know what's going to happen, so you judge the characters differently.
Yeah.
But really, they were making decisions in the moment with limited information and based on the norms of their time.
So how does this hindsight bias, like, specifically affect how we judge historical figures? Can you give me a real example?
Sure. Let's take the American Revolution. From where we stand now, it seems obvious the colonists would win their independence.
Right.
But for those living through it, the outcome was far from certain.
Yeah.
They faced huge risks and uncertainties, making decisions with limited information. Knowing the outcome totally colors how we see their actions.
So we might criticize a leader for a military strategy that in hindsight seems foolish, but at the time it might have been the most logical choice.
Exactly. Judging them solely on the outcome ignores how complex the situation was.
That's a great point. It's a good reminder to be a bit more humble about our ability to judge the past, don't you think?
Absolutely. Especially when we think about how nuanced individual lives were and how they were affected by these larger historical forces.
It reminds me of the example of Thomas Jefferson.
Oh, yeah.
This guy championed individual liberty, wrote the Declaration of Independence, yet owned slaves.
Mm-hmm.
How do we even start to reconcile those contradictions?
Jefferson's a perfect example of how complex this issue is. He was a man of great intellect and vision, but he was also very much a product of his time.
Right.
His actions, while reprehensible by today's standards, were in line with the norms of his era.
It feels like we're constantly going back and forth between acknowledging the past and judging it.
I know it's tough.
Is there any way to find a balance?
That's a question we'll keep exploring as our deep dive continues. But I think what's crucial is to remember history isn't about putting people on pedestals or carrying them down.
So if it's not about judging or glorifying, what is it about?
It's about understanding.
Understanding what?
Understanding all the complexities, the nuances, the evolution of human values over time. It's about recognizing that even the most revered figures were human, capable of both great and terrible things.
Wow, this has been enlightening already. I can't wait to see where this deep dive takes us next.
Me too.
Yeah.
It's a conversation that's challenging and incredibly important. You know, it seems like we keep coming back to this question of learning from history without getting stuck in judgment.
Yeah, like history isn't just statues and textbooks, right?
Right.
It's about understanding what shaped the world we live in now.
Yeah.
How do we do that without just condemning or glorifying the people who came before us?
It really is the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think the answer is in recognizing historical figures as products of their time, but at the same time acknowledging the impact their choices had, both positive and negative.
So walk me through that. What does it really mean to see them as products of their time?
It means understanding all the stuff that shaped their worldview, the social, cultural, and political forces.
Okay.
Like take Queen Elizabeth I, for example,
Okay.
often celebrated for her strength as a leader,
Yeah.
ushering in a golden age for England.
Right, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, her support of the arts.
Yeah.
She's pretty iconic.
Totally. But she also ruled during a time of serious religious persecution.
Mm-hmm.
Her policies towards Catholics, for instance,
Yeah.
acceptable then, but would be considered highly intolerant today.
So are we saying we should just excuse her actions because that's how it was back then?
No, not at all. It's not about excusing. It's about understanding the context.
Okay.
Elizabeth was working within a totally different political and religious landscape.
Right.
Her choices, while harsh, were probably influenced by wanting to keep things stable in a very volatile time.
It's like we're holding her to rules that didn't even exist.
Exactly. And that's the danger of what we call presentism. We impose our modern values onto the past,
Yeah.
which leads to a distorted and incomplete understanding.
So how do we avoid that? Acknowledge the bad stuff without erasing the good.
It's tough. It's a balancing act, for sure. We can celebrate Elizabeth's contribution to England's culture and politics, while also recognizing the darker parts of her reign. It's about acknowledging the full picture, good and bad.
This makes me think about all the debate about statues and monuments dedicated to controversial figures.
Definitely. That's where this clash between historical context and Mahdi values really plays out. It's happening everywhere, right?
Yeah.
Communities struggling with how to represent these figures whose legacies are so complex. Progress and injustice all mixed up.
Like taking down Confederate statues in the U.S. or renaming buildings named after people who profited from colonialism.
Exactly. It raises the question, what are these public symbols really for? To glorify individuals or to represent our shared history, warts and all?
And who gets to decide which parts of history we celebrate and which we condemn?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
No easy answers. It requires really thinking about both historical context and modern values.
Yeah.
Some people say removing these symbols is like erasing history.
And others say it's necessary to create a more inclusive and accurate view of the past.
Exactly. Complex issue. Both sides have good points. The important thing is we talk about it, with empathy and a willingness to understand different perspectives.
Okay, so we've talked about context, the dangers of presentism, this whole issue of public representation. But what does it all mean for, the average person trying to make sense of the past? What's the takeaway?
I think the main thing is judging historical figures shouldn't be about saying guilty or not guilty. It's about trying to understand.
Understand the forces that shaped their world, the choices they made, and what those choices led to. Remembering that history is messy, complicated, full of contradictions.
So it's not about erasing the past. It's about learning from it.
Exactly. The good and the bad. Studying the past helps us understand ourselves, our societies, and even the challenges we face now.
And hopefully we can use that understanding to build a better future.
Couldn't agree more.
This has been eye-opening. I feel like I'm seeing history in a whole new way.
I'm glad.
What are your final thoughts? What would you leave our listeners with? Okay, so we've talked about a lot, historical relativism and the challenges of judging figures like George Washington and Queen Elizabeth. Where do we go from here? Like, what's the takeaway for our listeners?
Well, I think the most important thing is to shift our focus from judgment to understanding.
Okay.
Instead of, just trying to label people as good or bad, we can try to understand their lives, the choices they made within the context of their time.
You keep saying context. Can you explain that a bit more? What does it actually mean to consider the historical context?
It means trying to see the world through their eyes,
Mm. Hmm.
the people who lived back then. It's realizing that their values, beliefs, even their knowledge, were shaped by things we might not even be aware of.
It's like trying to step into their shoes, but also their world, right?
Exactly.
Right.
Like, imagine trying to explain the internet to someone living in the 1700s.
Oh, wow.
They wouldn't even have the framework to understand it. Their world was built on different technologies, different social structures, different ways of seeing the universe.
That's such a good point. We take so much for granted. Forgetting people in the past didn't have the same information or ways of thinking.
Right, and that lack of information, those different ways of thinking, really affected their choices.
Hmm.
So when we're judging them, we need to think about what they knew, the norms of their society, the pressures they faced.
It's like recognizing they were playing by a whole different set of rules.
Exactly. It's not about excusing what they did. It's about trying to understand why they might have made those decisions, seeing them as human beings facing complex issues, just like us.
This makes me think about something I read about history being written by the victors. Makes you wonder, are we only getting a one-sided, maybe even biased view of the past?
Yeah, that's really important to consider. History is rarely objective. It's a story told by those who had the power to tell it.
Right.
And those in power often wanted to control the narrative to benefit themselves.
So how do we account for that? How do we get a more balanced perspective?
By looking for multiple perspectives. Read accounts from different sources, consider the voices of those who were marginalized or silenced, and don't just accept one story as the absolute truth. Be critical.
Sounds like we need to be historians and detectives all at once.
You could say that. To understand history, you need to be curious, skeptical, and willing to really dig deep, to uncover all those complexities and nuances.
Okay, so we've talked about understanding context, finding multiple perspectives, and remembering that history is subjective. But what does all this mean for the average person? Like, how should they approach judging historical figures?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is judging historical figures shouldn't be about deciding if they were good or bad. It's about this process of understanding. It's realizing history isn't some fixed thing. It's a conversation that keeps evolving with new perspectives and interpretations.
So it's not about erasing the past or canceling people who don't fit our values, but learning from their actions, the good and the bad.
Exactly. Recognizing that even people who did great things often held beliefs or did things that we find wrong today. But by studying them in all their complexity, we get a richer, more complete understanding of the past and how it shaped us.
It's about seeing them as people, flaws, and all, and using their stories to reflect and learn. I really like that. Any final thoughts for our listeners? Something to think about as they keep exploring history.
Maybe this. The next time you find yourself judging someone from the past, ask yourself, if I had lived back then with their knowledge and experiences, would I have acted differently?
Wow, that's a powerful question. It really makes us step outside our own viewpoint and consider all the complexities of the past. It's a good reminder judging is easy, but understanding takes effort, empathy, and a willingness to engage with all the nuances of history.
That's it. And that's the real value of exploring history. Not to judge, but to understand, to learn, and to grow.
Beautifully said. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into judging historical figures. Until next time, keep those minds curious and keep those conversations going.